Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books author reading series. If you'd like to learn more about us and our many upcoming author events, please visit skylightbooks.com, where you can browse our inventory, buy books, and join our Friends with Benefits Club. You can also follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook. To speak to a real live bookseller like me, please call 323-660-1175. Thanks for your support, and enjoy.
However, tonight we are celebrating Memento Park by Mark Sarvas. Following the reading, he'll be joined in conversation with Janet Fitch. Mark Sarvas is the author of the novel Harry, Revised, which was published in more than a dozen countries around the world. His book reviews and criticism have appeared in the New York Times Book Review, the Three Penny Review, Book Forum, and many others. He is a member of the National Book Critics Circle, PEN America, and PEN Center USA, and teaches novel writing at the UCLA Extension Writers Program. Janet Fitch is the author of the novels White Oleander, Paint It Black, and most recently, The Revolution of Marina M., an epic novel set during the Russian Revolution. Her short stories and essays have appeared in a variety of publications, including the Los Angeles Review of Books and Vogue. Fitch was a recipient of a Likachev Foundation Fellowship at St. Petersburg, Russia, and is currently completing the second volume of her Russian Revolution novel. Kirkus Reviews described Memento Park as a lively, thoughtful, psychologically compelling novel about the ties that bind and the ties that fail to. And Salman Rushdie described Memento Park as a gripping mystery novel about art that is also a powerful meditation on fathers and sons and the need to face up to the falsehood spawned by the horror of the past. We're delighted to have him here tonight to read and discuss Memento Park. Please help me welcome Mark Sarvas.
Thank you. Thank you for the lovely introduction. Nothing like a hometown crowd. Thank you. You've been going around the country to bookstores with a dozen people who don't know you. It's nice to come back to a room full of friendly faces. Thank you. So I'm going to just read a very short section because I'm a real big believer in short readings. Those are my favorite kind. I'm sorry. I'm gonna embarrass you for just a second because I'm so grateful. A lot of the people in this room are former students of mine, and I have in the front row here Leslie Schwartz, in whose workshop I figured out my first novel. So I'm really thrilled that she came out tonight. It means a lot to me. So I'm not going to get all weepy about it, but thank you very much. I'm going to read, as I said, a very short section from Memento Park, and to set up the novel a little bit, it's a story about a guy who is trying to recover a painting that he believes was looted from his family in the Second World War. And in order to recover the painting, he essentially has to recover his family's narrative, the lost history of his family, his relationship with his father, which is bad, and his relationship with his Judaism, which is worse. And that's kind of more or less all you need to know. He's an actor, an LA actor, but kind of one of those actors who just gets parts with no names, like Engineer Number 3 and stuff like that. But he's got a career doing that. And the novel is sort of it's framed as this. It's an internal monologue. It's an extended internal monologue, and he's in the sort of Sotheby's substitute the night before the painting is about to go on auction. And there's a security guard wandering whom he has dubbed Virgil. And so when you hear a reference to Virgil in his mind, he's sort of communicating with the security guard. And because the book is full of scenes in which Matt, my narrator, his father, is a pretty monstrous guy, I thought I would share one of the scenes in the novel where we see the softer side of Matt's dad. So without further ado, a very short reading from Memento Park. Oh, that's the wrong page. Virgil appears sufficiently convinced of my harmlessness to have begun a game of solitaire, which he attends with a dogged consistency that it's almost touching, though the cards do not favor him. Once or twice, a groan floats my way as yet another unwanted red king is turned over. I loathe the tense tedium of card games. My father played cards every Friday night at a Hungarian social club in Manhattan. Social club. The words evoke images of a world so foreign, a world in which people might socialize for no other reason than shared nationality. My father's mood was unfailingly bad the day after he'd lost, which was often, and he railed against the stupidity and the greater sin, in his view, the timidity of his partners who had no killer instinct. Those were his words, killer instinct, something he imagined he possessed in abundance. Dinah, I'm watching you now because, Dinah's our expert on how we give readings, and so I'm checking in with you. When I was 10, he had occasion to visit the club, as he called it, in the middle of a day, and he took me along on an errand the purpose of which is long forgotten. I'd only heard talk of it and had constructed such an elaborate fantasia of glamorous men and women, music, and danger that I leapt at the opportunity to see firsthand where my father spent his Friday nights. I suspect my disappointment was palpable as we mounted the steps of a sagging brownstone in Yorkville, the Hungarian neighborhood of Manhattan off 2nd Avenue in the mid-'80s. A battered green steel door embedded with a small square of safety glass gave way to a narrow corridor littered with refuse. Broken mailbox doors dangled at odd angles like decaying teeth. As the elevator approached, the silence was punctuated by the thunk of each floor brushing past. The door slid open in quarters that disappeared into each other, and we stepped into the tiny cab. My father let me press one of the 6 raised black buttons, and the floor number glowed amber. The elevator reeked of ammonia. We stepped out and walked down the linoleum-tiled corridor. My ghost father's footsteps rattled along cream-painted cinder blocks. We arrived at a dented and scratched olive door with a security eyepiece and a doorbell bearing the legend, The Tower Club. As I looked around for evidence of a tower, my father pressed the black lozenge firmly, and a full round chime answered. The door was opened by a middle-aged woman with orange shellacked curls, rhinestone-studded glasses, an architectural bosom, and eyebrows drawn at a rakish angle. This was Ildiko, and she smiled at the sight of my father, beckoned him to enter, and cooed over me, applying special accented ministrations upon the much-discussed but never-seen prodigal son. My father transformed, became Gubby, the boisterous, jovial charmer, a creature I'd glimpsed at dinner parties. It was a bravura turn, and I do know about such things. The scope of the part was small. A critic might call it one note, but he owned it and delivered a convincing, if broad, performance. Ildiko's interest in me spent itself quickly, and she assumed her place behind a bar stocked with dusty bottles of Crown Royal and Cinzano, speaking rapid Hungarian into a black telephone, and I was able to take in the room. What struck me first was the smell. Stale, like the cosmetics section of a cheap department store. The combination of scents laced with cigarette smoke and Ildiko's hairspray should have been revolting, but I swooned. There were 8 round tables covered with white tablecloths, nearly all of which were cratered with cigarette burns. Abandoned half-full glasses with cigarette butts floating in them. 2 of the tables were occupied. At the first, 3 men my father's age were playing cards. It was to this table that he attached himself, with an admonition for me to stay put and not bother anyone. But it was the players at the second table who riveted me. 2 elderly men sat in old military uniforms. One of the 2 was emaciated, his stubbled turkey jowls disappearing into his collar, which sat loosely around his blue-veined neck. All gray wisps, he seemed to vanish within his uniform. His friends suffered from the opposite problem, straining at the buttons of his jacket, constantly tugging at his waistband for elusive comfort. Moth-eaten ribbons rested upon their chests. Tarnished metals failed to catch the light. There was an absurd formality in their posture. Despite their dotage and infirmities, they sat rigidly upright, with a wan martial dignity. I strained to listen as the thin one drew a card and threw what I took to be some chips into the pot. I see your 20,000 Romani souls and raise you 5,000 souls. The fat general perused his cards once more and nodded decisively. I raise you 100,000 Bulgarian souls. A terrible expression crossed the thin general's face, as though a herald had just delivered the worst possible news. Bottom lip trembling slightly, he set his cards face down and spat in obscenity. The fat general nodded as if in agreement and collected his winnings. Not chips, but a pile of multicolored bottle caps intended to represent the souls in question. Fanta oranges, Pepsi blues, Sprite greens, Coke reds. Ildiko noticed my interest and leaned over the bar to whisper to me. The fat one, he commanded 5,000 men in Hungary. Terrible battles in the war. Almost died during the siege of Budapest. Now he's a janitor. The skinny one, he led 3 battalions, was tortured by the Germans, told them nothing. Here he delivers newspapers. She leaned in close. They say the fat one pushed Jews into the Duna. Who knows? She shrugged, a gesture meant to explain all tragicomic inequities to me, and I wished I was old enough to decipher it. I glanced over to where my father was kibitzing with his buddies and saw that he had noticed my interest. He looked at the two generals with distaste, and after thumping his friends theatrically in the back, rose and collected me. Effusive goodbyes were exchanged, and we found ourselves in the hallway waiting for the elevator. What is the Duna? The Danube, a river in Budapest. The woman told me she thinks the fat man pushed Jews in the river. Why did he do that? My father did not answer. Though I didn't realize it at the time, he was continuing a lifelong pattern of not discussing the war. I persisted. Who were those men in the uniforms? I asked. His reply was clipped, tense. Nobody. The elevator arrived and we stepped inside. My father pressed the ground floor button, depriving me of my little pleasure, but he rested his hand on my shoulder, a rare bit of physical contact that gave me even greater joy. Then he spoke again hoarsely. Ghosts, Matyash. They're ghosts. He jabbed at the ground floor button, eager to get me the hell out of there. I was never invited back to the Tower Club, which was demolished last year to make way for a luxury condominium. My two generals are surely dead by now, though I imagine them taking their game of souls elsewhere and continuing it until the moment when their own souls would be collected on another, larger table. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Janet Fitch. Woo.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Sarvas. Well,
thank you.
What a pleasure to read this. Let's see, we've met under many roofs. The LA literary scene has a number of sort of interlocking circles. So it's teaching at UCLA, where he's teaches the wonderful advanced novel writing program, UCLA Extension, and in the homes of friends at readings like this.
The David Francis Circle that brings so many of us into it.
That's right, my writing workshop. And I probably encountered you first on the page through your criticism and literary articles, most specifically the celebrated, dearly departed blog of The Elegant Variation. And the first question I think I'd like to ask is, having reviewed so many books and done so much criticism, do you find when you're writing, are you haunted by things you've said about other people's books? It's like, oh, that ending. Oh,
no, it's a wonderful question, actually. Haunted, no. I've got a borderline sociopathic relationship with conscience, so no. No, not haunted, but... And this is, for those in the room, and I know there are others who write criticism here, this is one of those sort of ongoing questions that ought fiction critics be writers of fiction themselves, or ought they not to be? And there's sort of merits to both sides. What ended up happening for me was all of that criticism really was my education. It was my first MFA. I'm in an MFA program now, of all things, but doing that was my way of figuring out what I thought about things. What I did come to learn when I wrote my own novel was just how effing difficult it really, really is. And when I look back at the many reviews I'd written, there's only one that I feel it's sort of a twinge of because it was a debut, and I was rough on the debut. Now, it was a debut that got a shit ton of money and a great movie deal, and I wrote about it in a fairly obscure newspaper, so I don't think it kept him up nights. But that has changed as I've gone through the process of writing, and I understand firsthand how much a writer invests in a big, long project, as you know, and how much of their lives they put into it. I think about that. Actually, my criticism is different and affected by it more than writing the novel has affected the way I write criticism, as opposed to memories of my snarky tongue affecting my novel writing. So
one of the things that I think is about teaching is that you're using a different muscle in criticism than you are using and also in teaching, than you use in your creative work. And I did read that you started this book as a first book and then put it away, that you didn't feel you were cooked yet. You weren't ready to write it. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I didn't even start it, actually. I had the idea, and my first short story was published in a now defunct magazine, not my fault, I'm pretty sure, in the late 90s, I think. It was a magazine called Troika. It was a nice glossy magazine.
Troika.
Yeah, and they published a short story of mine called The Number, which was also sort of a Holocaust-themed story about a guy whose infant son is born with a number tattooed. He's on his arm. He's born that way, and he has to figure it out.
I remember that
But
story.
I wrote that. That was me. You read that?
How
Wow.
cool is that?
Wow, that's
Wow!
this whole reading is now worth it for that. That's like wow. Yeah, I wrote that. And in my author biography for that piece said Mark is working on a novel about looted Nazi. It's the producers. We were not Nazis. Nazi art, but as I sat down, I realized I didn't know enough about how novels work. I wasn't confident. There's also a metric shit ton of research that I knew I had to do, and I wasn't quite ready to soldier up for that, so I instead wrote the first novel that didn't require research and became my, people talk about their training marriages, so that was my training novel, so.
Well, it was funny, one of the reviews of that first novel, Harry Revisited, by Josh Ferris, called it a coming-of-middle-age novel. And this is as well, in its way. There's something about that father-son relationship that you get to middle life. Of course, you have to have a Virgil. You're getting into the dark woods,
exactly,
and you need Virgil, who in this case is security guard, who's basically doesn't even pay much attention to him. But he has to have his Virgil. And what's interesting is that your character is an actor. So, as opposed to being, he acts. And he is a great, perfect Angelino. We come here, and the old people don't often talk about the old country. It's like, they don't want to talk. They don't say anything.
No.
Did you have an old country family? Is that what I'm picking up?
Yeah, I'm a first generation American. My parents came over from Hungary separately. That's a whole bizarre story in and of itself. And my grandparents actually lived with us in our house when I was a kid growing up, which is a very, I guess, common in the European model of things, and less so here to have extended family there. But the war was not talked about, all that stuff was not talked about. And in fact, it was a pretty secular household. There was no real Jewish observance of any kind. We had Christmas trees growing up. It was, but in my 30s, after around the time that I wrote The Number, I became more interested in the family stories. I would try to get my mother to tell me the stories. And she couldn't. She wanted to, and she would start, and she just couldn't speak. She was overcome by emotion. And I bought her a microcassette recorder. I thought, well, maybe if I'm not in the room, she could speak into. Couldn't do it. The funny thing is, she read, after reading this novel, bam, she calls me up on the phone and tells me this absolutely riveting story about the day she and her cousin, were almost killed in Budapest. The day that was the difference between life and death. Now that I wrote the whole damn book, now she tells me the stories. So,
do you think that they're protecting us, or do you think that you have to prove that you can handle the story? Yeah. What do you think was the difference?
I think it's a combination, right? I generally don't think anything is sort of just one thing, and I think that obviously it was my mother in particular. As there's a scene in the novel where Matt, my narrator, is given a family tree, and he can see all the people that died in his family. That came from life. There was a distant cousin of ours who did that, and when I saw through my mother's side of the family the extent of the devastation of my grandfather's family, and how many people were lost. I really understood why she couldn't talk about that. And now, as a new father, I also am alive to the dimension of wanting to protect children from, the absolute horror that is this world. So I think it's a number of those things swirling around in there.
Right, and then you have your Californian, Matt. Of
Yes.
course he comes here, and of course he has the beautiful Gentile girlfriend, and has no idea about Jewish culture. And then it is so interesting that to him, restitution is made in the form of this painting. Because restitution is, you make restitution to someone who has suffered. And oddly enough, the one person who has not suffered at all is our hero. The father, who is a guy who works the angles, oddly enough, doesn't want to have anything to do with this very valuable work of art. So there's a mystery locked into it. But this whole idea of restitution is really interesting, because until there is this possibility of restitution, he is completely divorced from his own past, from cultural past, from his religion, from the whole thing. And suddenly it's like, oh, yeah, I'm Jewish, and there was a whole...
Well, obviously, that notion of restitution it resonates, right? There are levels of it in the novel, and there's the obvious, the financial, the return of the painting, but there's also this relationship with his father being restored, these other things, and ultimately, and I tread carefully because I know there's at least one actor friend in the room here, but when I chose to make him an actor, it was partly because I needed to separate him from me, because Matt and I share some traits, but I didn't want it to be autobiographical, so I picked a profession I would never do myself, but that I knew something about because I had friends in that world and I could write about it reasonably authentically. But I also sort of like this idea of a person who sort of puts on persona, and it seems to me an occupational hazard that in putting on all those personae, one might lose track of one's authentic self. I'm not suggesting that that's the case here tonight.
If he had one.
But if he had one to begin with, right. So, and he is someone who's, I think, more comfortable putting on and discarding these different faces and selves. And it has enabled him for a long time to not look at this big, dark thing that's, right facing in front of him.
And then as he confronts it, it screws up his acting, because there's a deeper root.
He's in his head, he's in his head too much.
Yeah, that's coming down. There's a wonderful memorial that's created in the book that I don't know if this is real or whether you made it up, but it's in Hungary, of empty bronze shoes on the lip of the Danube to commemorate the Jews shot and killed in the river. That's real?
That's real.
See, I gave you credit for it. And there was something about those haunted shoes, which the empty shoes wait for us to fill them, right? There's an expectation, but if we had, we'd also be dead.
Right.
So it's the
and
paradox.
They can't be filled. They really can't be filled. So.
Right. And the father is a survivor. And he's got the killer instinct.
He does. And my own father, on whom this character is based, survived the war in sort of wild ways that are not even covered in this book. He got the papers of a Christian friend of his and lived out the war in his identity, smuggling food to his own father, who was like starving in the countryside. It was a pretty risky proposition. And then in '56, when the revolution came to Hungary, he escaped with literally like bullets flying past him as he was running across the border. So I wanted that to think about where the person who's been through all of that over there lands when they get here, and what they become. They've got obviously a relationship to all those things that formed them,
right.
But they're not running from bullets yet in America. So it's a different kind of existence that they're.
And then there's this whole invisible world that's part of their life, but their children look at them and they just see a blank space where that world is. Matt, when he is beginning the journey to restitution of this painting, is begins to work with an Orthodox attorney who he finds really appealing in ways he doesn't understand, because his gorgeous model girlfriend is like the best, so why? But he's so attracted to this Orthodox woman, and there's something about the way she touches the mezuzah in her office. She has to leave because it's almost sundown on Shabbos. And he envies that moment of touching the mezuzah, and he goes to buy himself a mezuzah. And this is I would love you to read this, Matt's floundering approach to the outskirts of his Judaism perfectly captured a trip to what my ex-husband would call a shalom shop in search of a mezuzah. So I've marked it. Can you read it?
Sure. I love doing this when other writers pick things that they want you to read, so that's always more fun.
Yeah, so it's these. I think you'll see the natural ending.
I'll just say, though, that actually, so Rachel, the attorney we're referring to, she's not Orthodox, but she's observant. She's conservative and observant. So he's gone into this store on Pico that, maybe many of us have wandered by shops like this. And here we go. I was suffused with a feeling of anticlimax. The echoes of that first meeting continued to reverberate, and I was desperate to feel that again, that purpose, that, dare I say, knowing how it will sound, love. And so it came to pass, after several weeks of quiet, I made my way to a small shop that carried Jewish specialty items. I decided to buy a mezuzah of my own, as though this might restore in me the quiet ecstasy I'd beheld. Yes, I'm aware of how foolish, how pathetic that sounds now, but if it's any consolation, it felt foolish and pathetic even then. I headed down to one of the Jewish neighborhoods that dot Pico Boulevard, and I stumbled more or less at random into a store called Solomon's. Yes, I know. Would I make that up? The shop was sunlit, although a faint odor of dust permeated the space. Moving through the store, one traveled from the general interest books in the front, through the religious accessories in the middle of the store, to the storehouse of religious texts in the rear. The character of the handful of customers seemed to progress along similar lines. Two women in jeans and T-shirts perused the menorah selection, while an elderly bearded Hasid fingered a Babylonian Talmud. I asked the Orthodox 20-something behind the counter where the mezuzahs were, and he directed me to the middle of the store, barely looking up from his text. Did he know a poseur when he saw one? Stop there.
Sure. It's his first venture into his Judaism is going, and let's suffice it to say, he leaves without the mezuzah. He just can't get it, can't quite pull it together. But there's a longing for he admires that connection that the attorney has with God, with a transcendent dimension of life, which doesn't come through his father. I don't know, but it's sort of his first attraction to his Judaism, to recovering it. And he starts in the outskirts, boy.
Yeah. Well, that sort of, that's one of the slightly more autobiographical parts that mirrors my own tentative journey through all this stuff. When I started to write this book, one of the things I realized is that, I was actually like a pretty lousy Jew. In fact, I recently wrote an essay called Notes from a Lousy Jew, because I hadn't been raised in the tradition. I didn't know the things one is supposed to know. And so a rather well-known rabbi, Rabbi David Wolpe, some of you guys may know him, he's a literary rabbi and a wonderful guy, sent me to a course, an 18-week course in Introduction to Judaism at the American Jewish University, where I met this dear, wonderful, bearded man who remains my friend to this day. And I remember looking around the room, and people would look at me like, "Why are you here? You're in already. What's?" But I had to go through this study and learn the things that I didn't. And one of the things that I found, I'm a pretty staunch atheist, and I guess I place myself in sort of the rational humanist camp, but I'm not one of those atheists who is sort of scornful of belief. In fact, I think I envy the solace, the comfort, the things that it brings to people who are able to have faith. And there's a part of me that It feels like I wish I could have that kind of faith. It feels like a defect, maybe, that I can't. But that was a piece that I wanted to sort of scratch raw when I was writing about Matt and look at that stuff.
And then when you look at, the disappeared in his family, when you look at the deaths and stuff, the religion was what marked them. So many of them didn't practice. They were secular Jews, but they were punished anyway. Yeah. It didn't matter how assimilated.
And that was very common when they came here. They would hide the fact of their Judaism. They were like too shaken up by everything. And we'll have a Christmas tree. We're going to blend in. We're not going to, make noise. And that was definitely something that I was raised in that kind of an environment. So
yeah. Well, it brings us back to that issue of restitution. The way at first it's like, oh boy, I get a painting that's worth a couple mil, yay! But the history comes with it. There is a restoring the history into his life as the painting comes in. So the restitution spreads out.
And that's the stuff, ultimately, that's the most important. Anyway, my hero, the recently departed John Berger, great writer, when he accepted the Booker Prize for the novel G, he famously said that clarity is more important than money. And I think that's maybe one of the ideas that is bouncing around in my head while I'm figuring out what the outcomes of this story are.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it, isn't it?
I think so.
Yeah, then I thought it was very interesting, and something I found incredibly true about how Matt feels. He returns to Hungary. It's not a spoiler, is it?
No.
He returns to Hungary to trace the provenance of the painting, and he goes to see where the fascist who actually got possession of the painting from his family to buy their way out of Hungary. And he goes to that neighborhood, and he looks at everybody like who is over a certain age a certain way, like, oh, you were here. And I was wondering if you would read that part.
It's funny, that's actually one of my favorite bits. When I decided what I was going to read on the tour, it was between that scene and this. So thanks to you, I get to read a little bit of that. Yeah. So I think you've set it up perfectly. I don't think we need to know anything more than that. To my surprise, I rang the bell. I had no plan, did not know what to say or do, but it didn't matter. No one answered. For some reason, the silence provoked me, and I rang again and again, longer and harder, and then I began to bang on the door harder and harder, and the knocking became pounding, obscenity-laced, and then I began kicking the door, which didn't budge an inch, bored beneath my blows. I paused in my shrieking to catch my breath. I was drawing attention from passers-by when I noticed a mottled old face, man or woman, impossible to tell, peering out through a tattered lace curtain next door. And although it's nothing more than melodramatic fancy, I'm sure it was snarling at me. She, a crone, surely. Had she known Halas? She was about the right age. What did she remember, the bitch? The lace billowed, and when it settled, the space in the window was empty. I turned and looked up and down the street, and suddenly every elderly face was suspect. A pensioner, do they call them that here? Hobbled by, hunched over a string shopping bag filled with canned goods. He wouldn't make eye contact with me, and although it was probably nothing more than an advanced case of osteoporosis, I was convinced it was guilt that stooped him.
See, this is where a Californian becomes a European.
Well, I've always had this weird, my parents are European. I was raised in a very European household, and when I'm here in the States, I'm very conscious of how European I can feel or seem or behave. But when I go to Europe, I feel like such a fucking American. It's like, oh no, you're an ugly American just like the rest. Don't flatter yourself. So I feel the tug of war of those sides. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So I had a question where you've taught for many years and are one of the great teachers at UCLA Extension, where everybody gets their chops.
Yes, many of us have come through that.
Oh yeah, and I thought let's talk about art being made in disastrous times. You know, as we're all,
whatever do you mean?
you know, you write about the artist Kálmán who has painted this painting, who burns his work, and yet is glad that he has sold some of it, that it would survive. How are we to think about our art as we're making it in these times?
It's funny. When you have a book coming out, you're asked to write a ton of free essays for people. That's what publicity looks like today. And I remember when I had that list of essays that I discussed with my publicist, I had one about like creating art in the age of Trump on that list. And I never wrote it because it kind of stymied me a bit. But I do remember, I got a number of emails from distressed and bereft students, and we've all had that feeling of, this is pointless, this is trivial, the world is going to melt down, why am I writing fiction? Which in the best of times can feel like a pointless and a trivial endeavor. And, the best I could sort of come up with is that it remains this thing that is just essentially and definingly human. I feel like to give that up is to surrender something that, it's the thing that separates us from the beasts. This capacity to create is precious. And I know that all sounds kind of corny and platitudey, but I believe that shit. And every morning when you sort of saddle up and sit down and you make this choice, do I read the day's headlines and feel my heart rate increase and my hands start to shake, or do I maybe close that off for a little while because my reading about it isn't going to change it or make the slightest bit of difference, and instead I'll take that energy and I'll put it into creating something, and maybe I'll get a random email from some person who read my book and they tell me that the book made a difference to them. And I don't know that we can hope for anything more grandiose than that right now, but I do think, in the name of all that is human, we have to sort of hold on to creating and believe in the value of this stuff, even when it really day to day doesn't feel like.
Right, it's like poetry is the news that's not.
That stays news.
Right.
Right, exactly.
It's not in the paper. Well, I think it's a good time to open it up to questions.
I'd love to hear from folks in the room if there are any questions at all about. Yes.
So that absence, I was very close to that. I was working in New York in a gallery, one of the very famous master galleries that really the last boat out and was able to deal with a lot of this work. And I was going through the archives of all their letters from the time, and I was so fascinated, and I wanted so much to talk and interview, and I don't even say.
Yep.
And that silence, which you so beautifully articulated. What is that? It felt a little bit like guilt to me. I'm going to say that.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you where that comes from.
So for those who can't hear in the back, distilling this question, it has to do with, does the silence, does the reluctance of people to talk carry a dimension of survivor guilt, essentially, with that refusal to talk? And, like I said, I think that's certainly a piece of it. I have some folks here who are in my workshop, and they've heard me say many times, like, nothing is just one thing. And so I really believe that, and I think that, sure, there's that knowledge of those who didn't make it, and why in the cosmic lottery did I get through and they not get through. And like I said, when my mother told me this story, it was really sort of blew my mind. But I also think, it is a trauma. Like, it's a genuine trauma, and I think that generation was coming through. They didn't have therapists on every corner like we have. They didn't have access, perhaps, to the ways of coping and contending. And certainly, my parents are Eastern European, and that ethic there is, you don't complain, you buck up, stiff upper lip, and just get on with your life. And we all know how well that works out for our emotional health and well-being. So I think it's a number of those things. It's the traumatic aspect, the guilt, the desire to put the past in the past and not burden, the generation that's coming up. There's a lot of things, I think, that swirl around that. So
and
I think
there's an odd, envy of the innocence that they have protected. That's part of the tension between the father and the son. The father thinks the son is an idiot. All fathers think sons are idiots.
That's why I'm glad I have a daughter. So
you've also, but the father's also been protecting the son from things that would make them less of an idiot, but not as happy.
Right, exactly. Vicki, I saw your hand go.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about process, and I guess I would narrow the question to, with this novel, what was the most important lesson you learned in the writing of it?
Sure.
The craft of the process.
So the question, if you heard it, was a process question. What was the most important or surprising thing that I learned in the writing of this novel? And again, it's actually something that you've now heard me say since. And it's the kind of thing, I think when we teach writing, and I imagine you've had the same experience, we say things that we believe to be true, have heard to be true, assume to be true. It's very different when we then experience that thing in our own writing, and then the lesson really changes. And what I really kind of learned is that if you aren't surprised by what you're writing, then the reader's not going to be surprised by what they're reading. And in my first novel, I had an outline. I had come from a screenwriting background, and I needed the training wheels, the comfort. It sort of got me through. And yet, even in that novel, the thing that I'm happiest with is a relationship that surprised me, that emerged. Here, I decided to follow a method of a few of my friends in the room who have written in less orderly ways, and just sort of drop in and write a scene here and a scene there and allow the book to coalesce, which is why the first draft took 4 years. But in that process, I had this, like we said, no spoilers, but I had this sort of moment of shocking surprise in the narrative. And it is a twist in the narrative that none of you will see coming, even though now you're alerted to look for it. I had an editor of a major publisher who wanted to buy the book. So he was the publisher, and he said, "How did I not see this coming?" He didn't see it coming because I didn't see it coming. And so, to open the space in writing, to be surprised by things, that was the big, reinforced through a life lesson, something that intellectually I knew, but I hadn't experienced yet. So David.
Having written a book, the father figure, thinking my father would not live long enough to read or not read, and I was wrong on both accounts. I'm wondering, in your experience, I remember you were writing this book and your father was still around, and the prospect of him reading it, and how was that for you, and had he lived to read it, how do you think he would have reacted, and how would you have liked him to react?
That's a great question. So I think you all heard that in the back. David's good at projecting. But I actually didn't start the book for a long time because I knew I didn't have the guts to write it sufficiently honestly while my dad was alive. And in January of 2009 is when I began writing the book. And at that, my dad had kidney failure for many years, and so he'd been on dialysis for a decade. And by January of 2009, he was spending more time in the hospital than at home. And it sort of waved the checkered flag for me. And I began to sort of write around the book. The truth is, I'll make this confession. This is like a father-son thing. Like, he scared the shit out of me. And I don't know, simultaneously, I think I would have feared his disapproval, and yet I also would have been reluctant to hurt him, So it was a very complicated relationship. I don't think I could have written it while I knew he would be there to see it. And my dad cooperated with my timeline, I guess, more than yours did. But my sister has read it, and my sister and my father were very close. And there was a couple of months where she wasn't talking to me because she felt I had committed an act of patricide on the page. Whereas my mother, who is a more sophisticated reader of fiction maybe than my sister is, understood what was going on in a novel and the fictionalization of the characters. So, but I'm not sure I would have, if he'd been hale and hearty, I might have written something else next. I don't know. Dinah.
So this whole generational thing. As a father, I'm wondering, Mark, if you discovered anything in writing, the research in the book or the writing, the book that changed the way you would broach this stuff with your own daughter?
The book, the birth of the book really and its evolution almost directly corresponds with my daughter's sort of birth and growth. I started as in January of 2009, and my daughter, who was supposed to be here tonight but was sick with the flu, was born in May. So as I was writing the book, sort of at the same time, simultaneously, I was learning to be a new father. I think, my dad, and as much as I've trash talked him here tonight, I love the old guy, and I know that he did the best that he could with me, given the time he grew up in, the place in the world, what he knew fathering should be. As I wrote the book, and it sort of put me in touch again, sort of revisiting those moments of cruelty, and certainly like sort of physical kind of harm. I knew I was never going to be a spanker. I was never going to do anything like that. But it really did sort of underscore that I wanted to have a warmer relationship with my child, where she knew that I love her and that I love her no matter what. My dad's approval, like Gabor's in the novel, always felt conditional. If you succeed a certain way, if you accomplish a certain level, he was thrilled when the first novel got sold, but he was thrilled because it got sold for a lot of money. That's the thing he cared about. And so, bringing him back under the microscope, I'm sure in sort of quiet ways, influenced how I treat my daughter.
Well, what about the history and the legacy and the Judaism? What about all that stuff? Is that more important than it was in terms of carrying on?
That's really complicated.
Well, we can talk about it.
We can talk about that in Vermont. No, the short answer, honestly, so without sort of airing all of my stuff in the world, Claire, as my daughter's mother, is Catholic. There were some sort of differences but because my religious faith, even having written this book, I don't now suddenly identify, I'm not observant still. I mean, I'm certainly very comfortable saying, yes, I'm a Hungarian Jew, I'm all of that. But it's not part of my daily life, and so I was fine with the Catholic school. The truth is that, and we were going to talk about this, like the world's still not a great place for the Jews. We have this idea that it is, and things are different, but they're not. And I really had to sort of think about my daughter's safety and how she goes around in the world and what she identifies as. And again, I decided that I'm going to, when she reaches of age, 18, and she wants to discuss, explore, look at these other sides of her heritage, because it is, and she knows Dad's Jewish, and we have those discussions, then we'll look at those things. But that's a hard one. I've struggled and stumbled a bit with that one. So, but thank you for asking a good probing question there. Thank you. Thank you. No, it's great. Miranda.
So, first of all, it's funny because I found tolerance also heroic. So, whatever. And you talked about putting the past in the past, and you can't now put the past in the present in order to relate his life. But one of the things that really struck me was his sort of realization over time that, or ours, that one's narrative, the story of one's life, isn't necessarily true. Whether it matters or not, that you tell yourself the whole story, and it may or may not be true. And that's also sort of structurally, as you alluded to, in your narrative of the book itself. The surprise. Were those things intentional? Did you have that idea already mapped out? Or did that
Yeah. Also, honestly, I'm glad that you sort of.
How smart are you?
I'm a lucky dope, but we'll talk about that. No, I'm glad you mentioned that about the father, because I'll also say that for dramatic purpose, I've made Gabor much more monstrous than my father was, but I've also given him some depth and dimension, that maybe my dad didn't have. So I've balanced out the scale in the end. I'm very instinctive. When I write, particularly in the first draft space, and even as I'm revising. But I knew I had this idea, and I still have it, that all the narratives of our lives are bullshit. You can't trust any of them. And I think about even now, to Dinah's question, like what am I going to tell my daughter? What is she going to know about me growing up? They're false, right? There is no narrative from day to day. We write a novel. We order events. We try to give our life a meaning, but it really isn't. And so I'm always very interested in the unreliability of all of that. Like, unreliability is a big thing with me, and I'm teaching right now, by great coincidence, Chronicle of a Death Foretold, which I hadn't read in years, and I only picked it on the syllabus because I wanted an excuse to read it again. But I was struck by how full that novel is with the unreliability of memory, how memories clash and narratives clash, and like the second something's in the past, you already can begin to not trust accounts of it. So I'm interested in that, and the things that I'm interested in sort of worm into the novel. I'm not that like smart or brilliant that it was super conscious, but I also think as you move through drafts, the writer's job is to identify potentials, like your own little patterns, your own little bugaboos, and say, oh, wait a minute, I'm a little obsessed with this idea, but there's something here that's narratively valuable, thematically valuable, that I can exploit and pump up. So a little luck, and maybe a little bit smarty or lucky. So, other questions? Yes, Olivia.
How I read it.
Thank you.
I wanted to know a little bit more about your research process and whether you actually traveled.
Sure.
Did you travel to?
Yeah.
Yeah. How did that inform your writing?
Yeah, so this book actually has a bibliography in the back, which is, I guess, unusual for novels. But there were so many works I referred to, and I was really grateful to those books, and spent a lot of years reading. And one of the books I actually read was a book on Jewish Budapest, and it was like the history of Jewish Budapest back to, medieval time. And I had gone to Budapest a lot as a child. I have family there still, but I hadn't been there since the early 90s. And I got to about halfway in the novel. In fact, it's just around the point where Matt goes to Budapest. And I realized I didn't have the freshness of the place. And so I went to Budapest for 5 stressful days with my family there. And was grateful again that there is an ocean and 2 continents between us. But I walked around Budapest, and it was really about the sights, the smells, the sounds, the sort of the tactile feeling of being there. But on that visit, my cousin took me to my father's childhood home. And that is a scene that is in the novel, when they go and they visit his apartment. So, and in fact, on that same visit, I went to Memento Park, which is the sort of graveyard of these Soviet statues there. So it was invaluable. It would have been a different novel if I hadn't made the trip, and I think less authentic because it had been too long. So anyone else? Yes.
I have a question about the character McCabe. I don't know if you read from that section or mentioned.
No.
And I was wondering if you could talk about McCabe was on death row and his trial, how that kind of relates to the protagonist and sort of larger themes of the book. It's a really interesting.
Sure. Wow.
Exception, but also I think it's related to what I'm curious.
Well, thanks. So the question is referring to my character's fiance, Matt's fiance, Tracy, is a anti-death penalty advocate, and she has taken up the cause of this death row inmate, Ricky McCabe. And her sort of her struggles and setbacks and disappointments along the way parallel what's going on with Matt's life, and that ended up in the book for a couple of reasons. The first is because in my first draft of the novel, that character of Tracy was kind of a cipher. I hadn't really considered her, I hadn't brought her to life. And as I was thinking about the things that I needed to make her more substantial in the second, I interviewed someone I know who does that sort of work, and she turned out to have a really strong social justice component. And so I thought, great, I'm going to steal that, and I brought that into the book. Where that ultimately became, I think, significant, where it became a little more than just, oh, here's the thing that this other character is doing to keep them busy in the narrative, is around this idea of, believing our own stories. And I don't want to say too much for those who haven't read it, but there is, just like Matt is an actor and Matt sort of puts on these personae and tells these stories, McCabe has sort of, I think, done something that is a little bit similar. And that's something that was also a surprise. That was something that only came out in a very, very late revision when my editors kept, still just poking me in the neck that this character didn't feel finished or done or good enough. And I was able to sort of peel that last layer back. And that's the part of his character that I'm the happiest with. I don't know if that remotely answers what you're asking, but that's sort of how that came about and why that's in the book. So, Anybody else? All right, well, then I think in that case, first I want to thank everybody. I'm so thrilled to see so many of you, and I'm really touched. Thank you. And I think Vanessa will come back up and tell us about book signing and all the rest. You want to? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget, you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.